On this Thursday night, 1 month later, 1% inoculated. What's being promised to boost the vaccine campaign as some provinces run out of doses?
We're relying on the federal government to do its best.
Calls for paid sick leave, how better benefits could help control the spread of COVID-19. Washington, D.C. ramps up security, what Joe Biden is being urged to do on his inauguration day, as President Trump's supporters vow to fight on.
It's not over.
Plus, spreading hate in Canada, the influence of the Proud Boys and other far-right groups in this country.
Global National with Donna Friesen.
Good evening and thanks for joining us. It has now been 1 month since the first COVID-19 vaccinations got underway. The federal government says it is making good progress on buying vaccines. Millions of doses have been ordered. Hundreds of thousands have been delivered, but getting them into the arms of Canadians is slow going. According to the University of Toronto's vaccine tracker, as of the last night, roughly 420,000 doses had been administered. That works out to just over 1% of the Canadian population. It is up to the provinces to administer them, and some premiers say they don't have enough doses. Some regions are now delaying giving the required second dose so they can get the first shot into as many people as possible. Abigail Bimman has our top story on the push to pick up the pace.
Called the ramp-up phase.
The ramp-up phase, phase 2 for vaccination in Canada.
It's anticipated to average more than 1 million doses a week for both currently approved vaccines, starting in April.
But right now, in the much slower phase 1, some provinces are critical of the rollout as they run out, even with more doses coming in. Alberta Premier Jason Kenney putting it bluntly, we need more shipments of vaccines now.
We're relying on the federal government to do its best to make sure that we have product here. That scarcity is still a challenge. And again, I'm not throwing any rocks here.
Both things can be true. There may be a modest supply of vaccine and vaccine not moving quickly enough. That's going out.
And with the modest supply, Quebec has been under fire for not committing to the second dose timeline recommended by the manufacturers. 21 days for Pfizer-BioNTech, 28 for Moderna. Thursday, the province made a new promise.
Our experts recommend that the second dose of the vaccine be given between 42 and 90 days. In our context, this is the best strategy because we have to deal with very few vaccines.
Recognizing supply challenges, the National Advisory Committee on Immunization has updated its timeline guidelines, but not suggesting as big a window as Quebec.
Preferably within 42 days. But I would like to emphasize that NACI's core recommendation is that the complete 2-dose vaccination series follow the authorized schedules.
The Johnson & Johnson vaccine only needs 1 dose, and this week the company said it's on track to roll it out by March. But no word yet from Ottawa about how close regulators are to approving it or the AstraZeneca vaccine. Abigail Bimman, Global News, Ottawa.
A new stay-at-home order is now in place in Canada's largest province, and an alert has gone out warning people. That's what buzzed on cell phones in Ontario this morning, a reminder that people must only leave their homes for essential reasons. There is an exception for people who have to go to work. Thousands of Canadians, of course, work in essential service jobs. For them, working from home is not an option, and if they get sick, many don't get paid. According to a Canadian health advocacy group, 58% of workers in Canada have no access to paid sick days. If they feel sick, staying home might mean running out of money for rent and food. As Mike Drolet reports, that's why there's a big push for paid sick leave for everyone.
In grocery stores and restaurants, long-term care homes and hospitals, frontline workers have been a constant throughout the pandemic. They've showed up for work regularly, but Rashev Brown says they never really had a choice.
Even though we're going through this pandemic, if you call in sick, there's still chances that your next shift that you could be disciplined.
And now health officials are drawing a direct line from the lack of paid sick days to workplace outbreaks, and Brown says they all know it.
So you need every single paycheck to survive. So you're basically putting yourself in a position where it's either I can't pay rent properly for the month, it's either I sacrifice on groceries this week, or I stay home because I'm not feeling well.
The issue of paid sick days is complicated and for the provinces potentially expensive.
The issue is, of course, that by legislating
workplaces to pay this type of sick leave, you're incurring a new cost for employers that they didn't have. And so in the middle of a pandemic, I think the provinces have said, we're not willing to do that.
So the federal government stepped in and created the Canada Recovery Sickness Benefit. But as the number of COVID-19 cases rose sharply since September, so too should have the number of CRSB applicants. Yet the opposite occurred. Why? Well, critics suggest the CRSB is flawed. The benefit pays $450 a week after taxes, which is less than minimum wage. There's no job security for workers, and payments can take 4 weeks to process. Local health officials and politicians have been clamoring for a new plan.
I'm almost to the hair lighting on fire time with this, where the fact there has been no response from anybody about this.
Is it fair to say that it's going to be extremely difficult to get COVID under control until we solve this key issue?
Yes, and one of the things that we have to look at is when this has worked is when we provided the most help. When we had CERB in place, when we had financial supports in place, when people could stay at home, they did. And it shows that public policy, when done the right way, works.
Mike Drolite, Global News, Toronto.
Saskatchewan has the most active cases of COVID-19 per capita in Canada right now. That province's top doctor is warning new restrictions may be needed. Today, Saskatchewan recorded 312 new infections. There are 206 COVID-19 patients in Saskatchewan hospitals. 33 of them are in intensive care. That is the highest number since the pandemic began. And those numbers could skyrocket. According to new modeling, if people don't follow public health guidelines, Saskatchewan could see up to 1,600 new cases a day in the coming weeks. Now to Washington, D.C., where security for next week's inauguration is ramping up to be the most intense in history. Members of the National Guard are posted inside and outside the U.S. Capitol and on the streets surrounding it. As many as 20,000 troops are expected to arrive in the coming days, the most ever deployed there. The public has been told to stay away. Presidential inaugurations are usually patriotic displays of the peaceful transition of power. This time, the goal is simply to get through it without any violence. Jackson Proskow reports.
Behind fences and under armed guard, the stately U.S. Capitol is now a fortress, ringed by layers of security and razor wire at a time of extreme domestic threat. The potential for violence to disrupt the inauguration is considered so high, the National Mall, where crowds would normally gather, may be closed to the public. The National Guard is on alert for improvised explosive devices and weapons. Members of Congress are urging President-elect Joe Biden to take the oath of office indoors.
I, for one, would much rather see it done inside for security purposes, in the rotunda, or in the hall of the House.
Consider is laid upon the table.
The second impeachment of President Donald Trump is doing nothing to quell the anger of his loyal supporters.
I unequivocally condemn the violence.
In scripted remarks, Trump called for peace.
Violence and vandalism have absolutely no place in our country.
But he has refused to back down from his lies about a stolen election or acknowledge the legitimacy of Joe Biden's win. And Trump's closest advisors are pouring fuel onto the fire.
The Democratic Party did violence to this country by attacking a president who I believe was legally elected on November 3rd.
At the same time, the FBI warns the January 6th storming of the Capitol is seen as a rallying cry by the far right. Pro-Trump message boards are filled with calls for a repeat on Inauguration Day. It's a long-term threat that will not end with Trump's exit.
A wide-scale domestic terror movement. This is going to be a problem that's going to be with us for months and years ahead.
Private companies are now wary of being used to facilitate any future violence. Airbnb has canceled all reservations in and around the Washington area during next week's inauguration. Several airlines are taking measures as well, including banning passengers from checking guns in their checked baggage. And they're also implementing new rules that require passengers to stay seated during the last hour of the flight before arrival here in Washington. Donna?
Jackson, there's been lots of talk about who President Trump might pardon before he leaves office, that it might include himself. What do we know about that?
Plenty of speculation that a whole bunch of pardons are coming before Trump leaves office for a number of reasons. One, it lets him change the channel from all that impeachment talk of the past few days. Number two, it's a sign of his enduring power here, even in his final days in office. And number three, it's a chance for him to reinforce his agenda at the last minute by pardoning friends who've seen him through these very tough days in his administration.
Lots to watch for. Jackson Proskow in Washington, thank you. A new American intelligence briefing is warning the attack on the U.S. Capitol is part of an ongoing trend of extremists exploiting protests to carry out ideologically motivated violence. The FBI has said white supremacists pose the greatest domestic terror threat in the U.S. That threat does not stop at the U.S. border. Extremists are thriving here in Canada, too. The founder of the Proud Boys is Canadian. And as Heather Yourex-West reports, the group has active chapters here.
This week's a great audience as well.
For months now, hundreds of people have gathered in downtown Calgary each week to protest COVID-19 restrictions. Among those attending on this December day, members of the white nationalist group, the Proud Boys. Last month, Global News asked Calgary's police chief if this was a concern.
I think the thing we're really keying on is the behavior while in attendance. And for the most part, I think this is the 10th rally that we've had since around August in relation to the marches for freedom. And all of them have been actually really quite positive, and we haven't had a lot of issues.
But their presence hit a nerve with Calgary City Councillor Jody Gondek. In December, she said in a tweet, "I'm broken today. Soldiers of Odin walk the streets of my city filled with hate for people like me, while so many silently watch it happen."
Everything starts somewhere, and everything starts small. And then if you give it the opportunity and the oxygen, it gets bigger.
Gondek believes what happened a few weeks later in Washington is proof.
We are not safe from what's happening in the United States. Exactly the opposite. We've contributed to it.
The Proud Boys, a group tied to the attack on the Capitol building, was founded by Canadian Gavin McInnes. There are chapters in every Canadian city.
We also have to keep in mind there are a lot of individuals that don't necessarily affiliate with Proud Boys or other similar groups, but are very much engaging with their social media platforms.
As the federal government works to determine whether the Proud Boys should be formally designated as a terrorist organization, many of their online platforms have now gone dark. But experts warn that these groups grow their ranks by exploiting the anger of others. And right now, at the height of Canada's second wave, the anger among many is intense.
People are angry about these lockdowns. They're angry about being required to wear masks, all of those pieces. So there's so many grievances coming together. It's like a boiling pot.
Making Canada no less vulnerable than our neighbors. Heather Yourex-West, Global News, Calgary.
Losing the U.S. election has made some Trump supporters even more steadfast. Coming up, we'll head to Pennsylvania to hear how voters are still standing by their man, plus a legal victory for survivors abused at Mount Cashel Orphanage decades ago. It's been decades since Canada's biggest sex abuse scandal was first exposed. More than 300 boys were physically and sexually abused by members of the Christian Brothers at the Mount Cashel Orphanage in Newfoundland and Labrador. Those who survived it are still fighting the Catholic Church over it. Today, the Supreme Court of Canada rejected an appeal by the Church, leaving it liable to pay. As Ross Lord reports, it is the end of a painstaking process for victims.
For more than 4 decades, physical and sexual abuse at Newfoundland's Mount Cashel Orphanage was suppressed by a code of silence, a cover-up that finally ended in 1989.
Then I felt a pain.
Some survivors have since received compensation, but others are still pursuing justice, including this 80-year-old man and 3 others who were identified legally as John Doe. He was physically and sexually abused over an 8-year period, ending in 1955.
Sexual abuse. At night time they'd come to your bed and they do what they, no, I won't describe it in detail, but there was sexual abuse and the physical was horrendous.
The top court's decision leaves the Catholic Church in St. John's on the hook for compensating survivors. The church helped the Christian Brothers establish the orphanage.
What the big thing about the decision is that people in higher authority have decided that the Catholic Church, the Episcopal Corporation, were guilty of negligence in their duty toward the boys in Mount Cashel. And that's the big thing.
Lawyers for the four men say they stand to receive a total of $2 million. The door is now open for more than 50 other survivors to claim compensation. Men who struggled all their lives with education, employment, and relationships.
So we're talking potential damages well into the tens of millions of dollars.
The Catholic Archdiocese of St. John's argued it should not have to pay compensation because the Christian Brothers were a separate entity. In a statement, the Archdiocese says it will review and analyze the court ruling. It says the church has immense sympathy for those who suffered abuse at the Mount Cashel Orphanage. The orphanage was demolished almost 30 years ago. The land has been repurposed, but survivors suggest what happened here will never be erased. Ross Lord, Global News.
Still ahead, new revelations about a suspected mole in the RCMP. After months of repeated requests, diplomatic disputes, and delays, a team of investigators from the World Health Organization has arrived in China. Their goal is to investigate the origin of the novel coronavirus, first detected in Wuhan, China. It's not clear what they'll be given access to. The team must now quarantine for 2 weeks and will begin work online. China has continued to reject calls for an independent probe, and theories on the origins of the pandemic have become highly politicized by both Beijing and Washington. China has allowed the two Michaels limited contact with their families more than 2 years after they were detained. Michael Spavor made his first phone call home over Christmas. Michael Kovrig was also allowed a call to family over the holidays. He'd previously been allowed to speak to his ailing father, just briefly. A spokesperson for the Foreign Affairs Minister revealed to Global News that Canada obtained agreements in recent months for what they call increased family and consular access for the two Michaels. The two men were detained shortly after the arrest of Huawei's chief financial officer Meng Wanzhou in Vancouver in December 2018. Canada has allowed family members of Meng Wanzhou to fly to Canada to visit her. Global News has uncovered exclusive new details about a former senior RCMP intelligence chief accused of leaking government secrets. Cameron Ortis was arrested in Ottawa in September 2019 and charged with violating the Security of Information Act. It's alleged he was preparing to share classified information. In 2015, Ortis allegedly offered to sell RCMP special operations plans to people with suspected links to Pakistani national Altaf Khanani's network. At the time, he was one of the world's most wanted money launderers. Many of his transactions helped arm and finance terrorist organizations, including Hezbollah and Al-Qaeda. Khanani was arrested in late 2015, but sources allege Ortis still intended to give the money launderer and his Canadian operatives sensitive information. Ortis is awaiting trial. None of the allegations have been proven in court. There is much more to this story, which sources say is one of the worst intelligence compromises in Canadian history. Global Sam Cooper has posted it on our website, globalnews.ca/globalnational. Next, the Americans still pledging to protect and defend President Trump.
You're watching Global National.
It's always hoped the start of a new year will mark a new beginning, but when it comes to U.S. politics and the pandemic, we'll have to be patient. Next week's inauguration will mark a turning point. America will have a new president, but all the anger that built to a violent crescendo last week has not vanished. Global's Mike Armstrong is on the road in America, and he stopped in a town in central Pennsylvania.
During the election campaign, the Trump signs in Lebanon County outnumbered Biden signs 10-1. Well, 2 months later, it's about 10-0. The Trump signs are meant to send a message.
I won't take it down. I'm a big Trump supporter and supporter of freedom and liberty.
Trump won this county with almost twice as many votes as Biden. It is, as they say, Trump country. Many are so convinced of that, they won't even admit Biden's going to be inaugurated in a week.
It's not over. It's not over.
That opinion isn't hard to find. In fact, directly across the street, Jamie Borer insists Trump isn't going anywhere. She admits to following the QAnon conspiracy group and says Trump's staying in the White House.
We'll have to wait and find out, but I think something's going to happen. God is in control, and I think God is going to make this happen.
3, 2, 1.
At the local park, this group tries to avoid politics, not because someone might get mad at them, but because they themselves might get carried away.
We have a swear jar here. I would really fill it up. Pelosi has hated him from the get-go.
Now, the reason we came to this town was to speak to a gentleman who lives just up Main Street, one of only 14 people arrested during the Capitol riots last week inside the Capitol building. Brown has been told by his lawyers not to do an interview, but we did have a conversation. He says he's still upset about the election and wanted his voice heard, but now he's nervous and hoping to avoid jail time. Well, the riot was a bridge too far for some. Steve Smith voted for Trump in 2 elections and has defended him over and over, but not again.
I don't know if you want to call it inciting violence, but he didn't do a whole lot to stop it.
Smith didn't support the first impeachment, but he understands the Democrats this time. That said, for the good of the country, he'd like to see it dropped. There's just too much anger already. Prolonging the whole thing, he fears, might make it worse. Mike Armstrong, Global News, Myerstown, Pennsylvania.
Tomorrow, I'll host an hour-long special about the future of American politics and the pandemic. You can watch 2021, What Lies Ahead, Friday on Global. And that is Global National for this Thursday. I'm Donna Friesen. Tonight's Your Canada is this beautiful scene at Sturgeon Creek in Winnipeg. There are beautiful places all over Canada. Please email your Canada to viewers@globalnational.com. Thanks for watching. Hope to see you here again tomorrow. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.